Hello and a very warm welcome to this presentation on the Broken Bay Institute's TEQSA site visit scheduled for the 18th of May 2016. My thanks on behalf of the Institute's executive team for making such a valued contribution to the life of the Institute by participating in this important day. We very much appreciate your time and indeed for all your contributions to the Institute. My name is Zachariah Duke and I'm delighted to talk through this process with you and indeed introduce you to our excellent application that was made to TEQSA in February 2016. We'll have a number of key personnel listening to this presentation, including the Institute's executive team, the Institute's Board of Directors, members of the BBI Academic Board, academic staff, both salaried and sessional, and our ever-important student support staff, and perhaps others as well. You're all very welcome. May I start by providing you a bit of a background and context. The Broken Bay Institute submitted an application to the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, commonly known as TEQSA, for registration as a higher education provider and for accreditation of a higher education course of study. And for those who are close to our application, you would know that we're proposing 4 courses of study and nested courses for accreditation. We submitted this application on Friday the 5th of February 2016. The Institute received notification from TEQSA on Wednesday the 16th of March 2016 that its application for registration and accreditation had been deemed appropriate and that the substantive assessment process would begin. There are a number of key elements involved in the substantive assessment process, one of them being the recruitment of experts within our course discipline area to review the courses of study and the units that we are proposing. But another significant part of this substantive assessment process is indeed a visit from TEQSA officials to ensure basically what we've said in our application is being lived out in practice, and also to inspect that the premises we have here at the Institute's head office in Pennant Hills, Sydney is indeed deemed appropriate for a higher education provider in Australia. Why are we asking you to listen to this presentation and to read all the relevant literature? It is essential that all staff, especially those who are participating in the interview, are adequately prepared. So in order to best prepare ourselves, may I now take a moment to introduce you to 3 particular points. Firstly, to introduce or perhaps reintroduce you to TEQSA, so what they're about, who they are, what purpose do they have, and why would they be conducting a site visit? Secondly, to talk about the standards in which our application will be assessed against. And finally, to talk through a few practicalities and nuts and bolts, if you like, in terms of the actual site visit itself. So when the TEQSA officials will come here to the Institute to perhaps interview you and to conduct their site visit itself. Before we get started, I want to ensure that you are in receipt of 5 important sets of documents. The first one is, I've taken a screenshot of the front cover of this first document, which I've titled the TEQSA Site Visit Briefing Paper. And this particular document that I've prepared includes all the relevant information that will be presented to you in this particular presentation, However, what I've included in the briefing paper takes on a more detailed form. So I'd encourage you to, at the conclusion of this presentation, to ensure that you're familiar with all sections of that briefing paper. Secondly, to familiarise yourself with the current Higher Education Standards Framework, and you can see again a screenshot of the front cover of that document. This indeed will be the basis, if you like, for the interview on the site visit day. So again, essential that you are very familiar with the standards that are appropriate to your particular interview grouping, and I'll return to that point as we proceed throughout the presentation. Thirdly, the Australian Government, and in particular the Department of Education and Training, have actually released a revised or a new set of higher education standards framework. These particular standards don't come into effect until the 1st of January 2017, so these standard framework will not be the standards in which our application will be assessed against. However, might I say the importance for you to be at least familiar with the new set of standards, and perhaps also to have somewhat of a cursory overview or understanding of these new revised standards. But may I emphasise the point that our application and the basis of the interview will be, for us, since we have applied to TEQSA before these standards have come into place, will be the existing standards, or perhaps more appropriately known as the current standards, and they're titled the Higher Education Standards Framework Threshold Standards 2011. Next, to be in receipt of the relevant sections of BBI's application to TEQSA that is relevant to your particular interview, and that's the job of the HEP Ready team and the personnel that make up that team, and I'll introduce the members of that team in a moment. That's our job, to provide you with the relevant sections. So indeed you can trust that when you are in receipt of the sections of the BBI application and the relevant sections that are relevant to your particular interview, that's all that you will need to know. And finally, the relevant BBI policies that are referred to in our application proper, again, that will be relevant for your particular interview. May I introduce, or as I mentioned, perhaps reintroduce you to TEQSA. TEQSA, the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, was established by the Gillard Labor government in 2011 and was brought into fulfilment with the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency Act 2011. TEQSA is Australia's independent national regulator of the higher education sector. So in short, their mandate and legislative function is to regulate and assure the quality of Australia's higher education sector, including public and private universities and other higher education providers with and without self-accrediting authority. It goes without saying that all Australian higher education providers need to comply with the Higher Education Standards Framework that I mentioned and introduced you to earlier, to be and indeed to remain registered as a higher education provider with TEQSA in this country. In 2008, the Australian Government, then under the leadership of the Minister of Education, Julia Gillard, commissioned an expert panel chaired by Emeritus Professor Denise Bradley, quote, to consider the many issues and challenges facing Australian higher education sector, end quote. One of the many recommendations of the Bradley report was to establish an independent national regulatory body. Before the establishment of TEQSA, higher education providers had to comply with state and or territory-based accreditation processes. However, quote, a national approach would provide a more effective streamlined and integrated sector, achieving a sustainable and responsible higher education system in the larger, more diverse and demand-driven environment." End quote. TEQSA's approach to assessing applications for HEP status is indeed one based around a risk and standards approach. So TEQSA's approach is underpinned by three principles. And if I can stress to have these three principles front and centre over the next couple of weeks leading into the site visit, and especially on the site visit day. Firstly, reflecting risk. Secondly, regulatory necessity. And thirdly, proportionality. And something that underpins all these three principles is the organisation's or the candidate that's applying for HEP status approach to which they care and support their students. So again, if we could have that front and centre in our minds over the next couple of weeks and again on the actual site visit day. Okay, to now talk a little bit about the standards. In order for TEQSA to commence its regulatory role in January 2012, TEQSA, with the assistance of an expert advisory body, developed a set of standards to assess the performance and quality of higher education providers in Australia. So in a similar way in which academic staff within a faculty would assess a student essay against a criteria or perhaps a marking rubric or a schema or something like that. These standards, so the current standards, are known as the Higher Education Standards Framework, Threshold Standards 2011, and these were codified in legislation in December 2011. The standards specify a minimum criteria for organisations to meet across a number of different key performance indicators. That is, minimum standards in order to gain and maintain registration to operate as a higher education provider in Australia. These standards consist or can be summarised in four key areas. Firstly, provider registration standards. And these standards feature organisational matters such as provider standing, financial viability, governance and management structures, our responsibility to our students, and other resourcing and infrastructure points. Secondly, provider category standards. And these standards outline the precise classification of a candidate institution. So whether a candidate is applying for university status, perhaps an Australian university college, or a self-accrediting HEP status. Thirdly, provider course accreditation standards. And these list the criteria for the granting of full or perhaps partial self-accrediting status. And finally, the qualification standards. And these directly relate to the Australian Qualifications Framework, or more commonly known as the AQF standards. Now just to note that obviously all four of these groupings of the standards are very important. However, for the context of the interview and the site visit day, those standards listed as number 1 and 3, or those in the red burgundy coloured font in front of us now, are the ones that I would ask you to focus on. And I'm not suggesting that the other two areas aren't important. However, for the focus of the TEQSA site visit, these are the two categories of standards that will be at the forefront of the TEQSA officials when they visit us. Just to note, as I've already pointed out, the Australian Government, and in particular the Department of Education and Training, have codified a new set or a revised set of standards, and these are known as the Higher Education Standards Framework. So the Higher Education Standards Panel finalised its consultations on and review of the Higher Education Standards Framework in late 2014. The Higher Education Standards are the basis for the regulation of higher education providers and courses by TEQSA. The current standards, so the ones in which BBI will be assessed against, will remain in force until the 31st of December 2016, while the new standards, the ones I'm talking about now, will come into effect from the 1st of January 2017. It's my view that these new standards will support continued improvement in the quality of Australian higher education while easing the regulatory burden associated with TEQSA's provider registration and course accreditation assessments. And this probably points towards the current coalition's government's approach to reducing red tape and minimising the amount of regulation that particular organisations, not only in the higher education sector, but across all sectors and industries. I'll take a few moments now just to talk about the practicalities of the site visit itself. So this is what you can expect when the TEQSA officials come to visit us. As I mentioned, the date has been confirmed as Wednesday the 18th of May 2016. BBI will be welcoming two TEQSA officials. Firstly, Dr. Michael Tomlinson, and his position within TEQSA is Senior Director of the Provider Assessment and Engagement Team, so a very significant and senior person within TEQSA. And Michael's assistant, one of his many assistants, Ms. Aysen Mustafa, and her title is Senior Case Manager, Provider Assessment and Engagement. Aysen has been our chief point of contact with TEQSA, so whenever the HEP Ready team do indeed have any questions, Aysen is the person that we email, and she's been excellent in terms of getting back to us with clarifications, and really great in terms of keeping us up to date with the whole process itself. Undertaking a site visit to a provider helps TEQSA to assess applications relating to registration and accreditation. During a site visit, staff gather to give evidence and indeed to validate statements that were made by a provider in support of compliance with the threshold standards, and to verify that a provider's policies and procedures are actually followed in practice. The site visit is not merely intended to allow TEQSA to view physical resources, however that is an important part of the process itself. TEQSA has the final authority to decide who will be involved in each interview session to ensure that the best opportunity to triangulate evidence, that being to ensure that the evidence and our processes and policies are repeated consistently across a number of staff, and to gain an accurate picture of the practices in place across the actual institution. Discussion sessions at the site visit are held in camera, that being confidential within a closed meeting room, and participants can be assured that TEQSA's findings will not attribute comments made during a site visit. TEQSA will also not record any of the interview sessions that take place, nor are we, as the Institute, able to record the interview from our end. Now, it could be possible that perhaps those, especially those who are involved in the interview process, might be feeling a bit of anxiousness or perhaps worry. Can I assure you not to feel anxious? And I think, and I hope it's my expectation that once you listen to this presentation in full, as well as take the time to read all the documents that are sent to you, I'm sure that any anxiousness that you have will be eliminated. The HEP Ready team, which consists of my colleagues Dr. Dan Fleming, the Dean of Studies, as well as Ms. Amelia Buchanan, who is employed as the Executive Officer at the the Broken Bay Institute. We'll be in touch over the coming week to organise a number of different briefing sessions which will occur throughout the rest of April and perhaps the first couple of weeks in May. On top of this, and you would have already heard about this, the Institute will also be conducting a site visit, what we've called Dryrun, the day immediately before the actual site visit on Wednesday the 18th of May. So on Tuesday the 17th of May, you can expect that we will be simulating as best as possible or recreating the space or the atmosphere in which the interview will actually play out. So members of the HEP Ready team will act or simulate the TEQSA officials, and we will be asking a number of different questions, and it will provide you an excellent opportunity to frame particular responses. And then the purpose of the dry run is to really workshop your answers, and perhaps those who have been close to the Institute's application, those members on the HEP Ready team, can perhaps point you towards a better answer to a question that might be asked, or perhaps to clarify or to point you into another direction whereby you should perhaps refer to another policy that you missed, or so forth. So with these measures in place, I'm sure that you'll be adequately briefed enough to enable to really excel in the actual site visit on the 18th of May. And I would invite, if you have any questions, to please get in touch with either myself or my two esteemed colleagues that are working with me to ensure that we are HEP ready. Now, the interview itself will take place with different groupings that will be interviewed at a given time. And just to note that you won't be interviewed individually, you will be interviewed as a collective group. So the groupings in which will be interviewed on the day include the executive team, which comprises of the Chief Executive Officer, the Chief Operating Officer, the Dean of Studies. We also have the Executive Officer, counsel to the executive team, as well as the National Coordinator of Professional Development and Short Courses. So all those key personnel, those 6 people, will be interviewed together, and they will be interviewed against the provider registration standards, and in particular sections 1, 2, 5, 6 and 7. So again, those who are listening to this presentation from the executive team, if I could stress to please ensure that you are familiar not only with the standards of these particular sections, but indeed the application that we've made to TEQSA, as well as all the policies that are referred to in the application. Make sure that you are familiar with all of those. The second group, some of our Board of Directors will be interviewed by the 2 TEQSA officials, and the Board of Directors, and in particular TEQSA, will be wanting to hear the perspective from the Board of Directors on these particular standards. And you can see that there are some overlap, which again stresses the importance that we are all on the same page and can provide as much as possible a consistent answer to TEQSA when they ask a particular question. So the Board of Directors will be interviewed particularly on the Provider Registration Standards, sections 2, 3, 4 and 5. So again, if I could ask that you make yourself familiar with those sections. Members of the Academic Board, your job is perhaps a little bit more difficult because you are asked to, you will be interviewed on a more across-the-board approach, given it's at the academic level. TEQSA are also keen to hear from you in terms of our actual courses of study and how we have mapped according to those particular standards. So members of the Academic Board will be interviewed on Provider Registration Standards sections 3 and 4, as well as Provider Course Accreditation Standards sections 1 to 6. So if I could kindly ask that members of the Academic Board to please be familiar with those sections, and again with the relevant parts of our application to TEQSA. Valued members of our academic staff, both salaried and sessional, you will be interviewed on Provider Registration Standards sections 3, 4, 6 and 7, on top of, similar to the academic board, members of the academic board, provider course accreditation standards sections 1 to 6. And finally, members of our support staff, which will include representatives from our student services, as well as other key personnel that really have a key and prominent role in assisting our students, including our ICLT manager, as well as our librarian, who obviously the resourcing of materials for students to use throughout their studies is obviously very important, not only to us, but obviously to TEQSA too. You will be assessed according to provider registration standards sections 3, 4, 6 and 7, as well as provider course accreditation standards sections 1 to 6. So you can see the repetition there, and again the heightened importance for us to provide to TEQSA a consistent answer that would be expected across those 3 different groupings. So important for us to be very familiar with not only the standards but what we have actually said to TEQSA in our application, as well as, again, sorry to keep repeating myself, but to any policies or documents that are referred to in our application itself. As I mentioned, TEQSA will also be here to inspect particular things that we'll need to have in operation. Indeed, a lot of this we already do have in operation. So TEQSA will want to see our online learning systems, so our Blackboard learning management system. So they'll want to see that open on a computer, and perhaps for a key number of faculty as well as our ICLT team to go through with TEQSA and introduce them to our online learning environment. They'll want to observe what we provide in terms of library resources and also evidence of subscription to, again, proportionate to the number of courses and the number of students that we are intending to provide them with access to adequate online journals and other resources. Now, the key and important part is the way in which we actually store student records. So they'll want to see physically how we store securely student records here at the Institute, but also how we store electronic files, student records and files, and how we do so safely and securely. TEQSA want to see our IT infrastructure as well as relevant IT support and what processes we have in place in terms of our help desk that we will be providing our students, as well as observations that we adhere to relevant work health and safety policies. Well, that brings an end to the presentation today. Now, I'd invite you to please, again, take a thorough look through those different sections that I've orientated you to today. And indeed, if you do have any questions, to please get in touch with either myself, Dan, or Amelia, who will be working on to ensure that we are ready to commence as a HEP